Hello, welcome back again to COM 100 Rhetoric and Society. Today and this week, we're going to continue our exploration of some important rhetorical devices that are commonly used. And the reason we need to explore these is because uh, while they're pretty common and relatively simple, they provide a huge impact in terms of creating meaning and the things that you can do with them. And they show up in a lot of important rhetorical artifacts that you're going to encounter. And so, aside from giving you something interesting to say and talk about when you come across them, they also will empower you to become a better writer, more creative thinker, and potentially a more eloquent speaker. So let's look today at understatement, euphemism, and hyperborea. All of these sort of contribute to an art of subtlety. Basically, we can say a lot without having to say much at all and don't have to be particularly grandiose or wordy, which for me is a little hard, but we will do our best. First, let's talk about understatement. Uh, what does it mean? We sort of have an idea of what understatement is, like we would understand if something was understated, but what does it mean? What does it mean for something to be understated or for understatement to be used as a rhetorical device? Well, we can just look at the definition, quite frankly. It's a deliberate description of a situation in a way that makes it seem less important than it actually is. So it's a way to describe things to make them seem less of a big deal, to make them seem less important, which actually has a lot of rhetorical functions that you might not realize. So here are some of those functions, some of the reasons we use it, and a couple important distinctions. First, it's the opposite of hyperbole. Hyperbole is exaggeration, is making something large. Understatement is the exact opposite. If the goal of hyperbole is to blow something up, to make it extreme, grotesque, or flashy, understatement does the opposite. It makes things small, discreet, unnoticeable, or at least less noticeable. It's often used for humorous effect, right? A lot of times, one-liners in like action movies are understatement, or at the very least, some sort of verbal irony. But it's typically used for humor. Someone, falls down, goodness, like a hill in an action movie or something, and you can like, are you all right? And they're like, yeah, I'm fine. Right? Clearly an understatement because they've just fallen down a large hill. And it's often used for irony. Understatement is a big component of verbal irony. It's a way of saying something different from potentially what you might expect the situation being. The relationship to irony is also worth exploring for a few reasons. One is that, like irony, understatement is based on knowledge and based on what we know and expect from a situation. The audience or receiver of our communication must have knowledge that the situation is more magnanimous than the speaker describes. In other words, if as an audience you don't know or don't realize that something is being understated, then it's not going to work. So you have to have a separate distinction to understand that something is being understated. Also, without knowing that something rhetorical is happening, if we use understatement, then we're just lying. And so knowledge, while it is the core of irony, it also has a very big role to play in understatement, which itself is often used for irony. So there's a lot of overlap there. And when you have the knowledge of the situation, whether it's a deep knowledge or just a working knowledge, it dissolves the need to take understatement literally. So when you have a knowledgeable audience, whether they know you as the speaker or they know the situation, then you've got an opportunity to use understatement. Otherwise, again, it just seems deceptive, and we don't want to do that as a rhetor. Here are some famous understatements from history. I thought these were really funny. This is from Donald Rumsfeld. Death has a tendency to encourage a depressing view of war. Yep, I'd say so. This is Sir Cosmo Duff Gordon, an incredible name, and he survived the sinking of the Titanic and said, "It was a rather serious evening, you know." Yes, Sir Cosmo, I'd say it was. And we have Watson and Crick talking about their discovery of the DNA double helix and what DNA is anyway. The structure has novel features which are of considerable biological interest. Yep, it pretty much revolutionized uh, how we study human biology and microbiology. It was a big deal. And here we have Emperor Hirohito. The war in the Pacific has not necessarily developed in Japan's favor. Yes, I think we would all agree that that was an understatement at the end of the war. But think of personal examples you might have of understatement. When do you use this rhetorical device? When do you purposely understate things? I'm more of a bigger fan of hyperbole, but understatement is also a lot of fun. Let's get back to the specific rhetorical function. So, like the implications of using it, things you can use it for besides just making a joke or being verbally ironic. Well, one thing you can do is avoid or shift blame. If you are underplaying something, then you're not taking direct responsibility for it. And if you're not taking direct responsibility for it and are actually underplaying the impact that it's had, then you can avoid or shift the blame for whatever has happened simply by the way that you're communicating about it and the way that you're presenting it to other people, which is a pretty powerful function. Uh, Also, this is part of the definition, but you're literally weakening the impact of information if you're understating it. If you're presenting something, that's not really a big deal, we just lost 4.5 billion, it's fine, not a big deal. Right? You are weakening the impact of that information versus if you are sounding the alarms for the same situation. So, again, another interesting rhetorical function. And then the last one, and humor is a rhetorical function. Humor is something that we want to have in our speeches. We can use understatement to make a joke. Let's talk about euphemism now. What is a euphemism? We hear the word a lot and we use them constantly in our speech and in our conversation, but do we have a good idea of what they are? Again, let's look at a definition. Euphemism is a mild or indirect word or expression substituted for one considered to be too harsh or blunt when referring to something unpleasant or embarrassing. Basically, euphemism is a way to rename something that we might feel weird talking about. And if we rename it, if we change the way we're talking about it, or at the very least the words we use to refer to it, then maybe it won't make us feel as awkward or as embarrassed to talk about these things. But there are some implications there. But first, let's look at some examples. And there are lots and lots of examples. We say passed away or moved on instead of died, ethnic cleansing instead of instead of genocide, negative patient outcome instead of died in the hospital. We talk about other examples that we use when we use euphemisms that are pretty popular. When we talk about sexual activity, we'll mention that people are hooking up, they're talking, they're shacking, things like that. We don't say the technical term, right? And sometimes intentionally keep these things vague so we don't have to define a relationship. It's an interesting rhetorical tactic, and if your romantic partner is using it, call them out on it, right? Vagueness is a rhetorical tactic. And then also with drug use, we have tons of euphemisms for the feelings that we get when using drugs. We'd be high, tripping, rolling. Ask people if they have drugs holding. We've also got buzzed and all sorts of other terms that we use to describe the effects of drugs. Why do we use euphemisms? Well, some of the reasons we use euphemisms um, are related to what we think we can talk about and what we think we can mention directly. but then also things that we think, like the definition said, are rude or unpleasant, which means that the things that we have euphemisms for and the things that we have a lot of euphemisms for are things that we think are unpleasant or embarrassing, but still talk about a lot. Right? If we've got a lot of euphemisms for something, it means that it's probably a pretty big taboo socially, but it's still something that we're very interested in. And there are a lot of things like that. And if you look at the history of the colonization of America, when we have pilgrims coming over, Puritans, these people were trying to escape religious persecution, and wanted to be a bit more sort of buttoned up about things. And so the fact that we have so many euphemisms and so many places that we apply it, given the religious history of the colonization of America, it shouldn't surprise us, right, that we have so many lingering euphemisms in our language. And also pay attention to the things that people will use a euphemism for, because it's signaling that they think whatever they're talking about is unpleasant, embarrassing, or rude, or whatever the case may be, and needs to be changed to be more acceptable. If people are using a euphemism for a way to not deal with something directly, that's a pretty big clue about their intentions, or at least their thoughts and feelings about that subject. So pay attention when people are using euphemisms. The last one we'll talk about today is hypophoria. Have you ever heard of hypophoria? Maybe not in that term, but hypophoria is basically just a rhetorical question. Honestly, if we define it specifically, it's a figure of speech in which a writer or speaker raises a question and then immediately provides an answer to that question, right? It would be and I've done it in this presentation already. What's a euphemism? Let's look at the definition, right? I'm setting something up and then going forward with the speech. And I'll say this now, when it comes to giving a speech and constructing one, I always encourage people to avoid rhetorical questions. And the reason I encourage that is because if you don't immediately provide the answer sort of in the same breath, in the same moment, then your audience is going to think about that question. They're going to think about their answer to your rhetorical question. And that's going to disconnect them from your message. And it might make it harder for them to tune back into what you're saying. You're going to have to try a lot harder to up the energy to get the feedback that you're looking for. But they can also be used to great effect as well. This is, I'm not going to play it so we can avoid a YouTube strike. This is from The Merchant of Venice, and it is Al Pacino doing Shylock's monologue. If you prick me, do I not bleed? If you tickle us, do we not laugh? It's a great scene, and it's talking directly about anti-Semitism, which is fascinating, coming from Shakespeare. But also he asks these questions and then immediately answers them, or he's already given us the answer to these questions, so they're purely rhetorical. He's not actually asking the people he's talking to about these things. He's making a point by making these things questions, and especially the way that he repeats these questions. It just sort of amplifies the rhetorical significance and the rhetorical effect of the hypophoria of the rhetorical questions. There's lots of examples from literature, from Truman Capote's A Christmas Memory. Truman Capote, of course, an Alabama native. 31 cakes dampened with whiskey bask on windowsills and shelves. Who are they for? Friends. Right? He asks that question, who are they for? And then immediately it's answered with friends. Right? Not necessarily friends. Indeed, the larger share is intended for persons we've met maybe once, perhaps not at all. People who struck our fancy, like President Roosevelt, right? It ends with a joke. And also Charlotte's Web, right? E.B. White uses hypophoria or rhetorical question with an immediate answer as well. After all, what's a life anyway? We're born, we live a little while, we die. A spider's life can't help being something of a mess with all its trapping and eating flies. So Charlotte here is asking, what's a life anyway? Right? And we don't need to ask that question because the point of her asking the question is so she can answer it. It's a setup. It's hypophoria. But in doing it, it's a little bit artful, right? It creates a moment in the text, in this case, that breaks it up, right? Maybe it's a little unexpected. And it's important to vary things like that. If you have a bunch of the same kind and length of sentence over and over and over again in your writing's going to be tedious to get through just because it's the same thing over and over again. So mix it up. Play with the rhetorical devices that you're using, play with the lengths of your sentences and how they're constructed, and it will have a much more dynamic piece of writing. Why do we use hypophoria, do you think? Well, one of the reasons is because of the variety that it provides, and I just used it right there. Another reason is you can get people's attention and then immediately sort of assuage any questions that they have. If I were like, what is on the quiz? Well, let's look at the review, right? You might get a tinge of anxiety hearing about the quiz, but when I, as a speaker, then say, let's look at the review, it's like, oh, okay, let me pay attention to this. So as a speaker or a writer, it's a good tool to use, not only for the variety it provides, but also as a way to get the audience's attention and to get them on a mode of listening that's way more engaged. And that's what you want as a speaker or as a writer, right? You want an engaged audience. You want people to be on the edge of their seats, even though their ticket pays for the whole chair. They'll only need the edge, right? If we're using rhetorical devices to our advantage, to make our writing, to make our messaging more interesting, more appealing, and to get the advantages that they provide or can provide if we're using them in certain ways. Okay, so that is those three rhetorical devices. Coming up, we'll discuss a couple more and make sure that we're feeling confident about these. If you heard my dogs barking earlier, I apologize. They likely saw a squirrel outside. We'll be back later this week. I hope you have a great day, and I'll talk to you later.